Good evening to Asia, good afternoon in Europe and Africa, good morning from the Americas. Thank you for joining us. This is the 5th installment of our Special Academy series focused on uniting business to respond to COVID-19. I'm Dan Thomas, the Chief Communication Officer for the United Nations Global Compact, and we're thrilled to continue to hear from so many extraordinary leaders around the world and to be joined by thousands of people every week. Despite the time differences, we seem to be attracting a truly global audience, and we thank you all for your attention and interest. Just last week, the United Nations Secretary General warned that COVID-19 is a public health emergency that is fast becoming a human rights crisis. In today's Academy session, we'll be taking a closer look at the way this crisis is impacting human rights, why human rights must underpin all of our response and recovery efforts, and what business, government, the UN system, and civil society can and are doing to respect and protect human rights in the face of COVID-19. Today, we have a very distinguished lineup of speakers. Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. From the government of Bangladesh, His Excellency Anisul Haq, the Minister for Law, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs. He'll be joining us. Oh, there you are, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but by no means least, one of the UN Global Compact's most committed business leaders, Mr. Roberto Marquez, Executive Chair and the Group CEO of Natura & Co. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. The UN Secretary General just released a report on COVID-19 and human rights, in which he stated that human rights are key in shaping the pandemic response because they focus attention on the people suffering the most. It's clear that while the virus does not discriminate, its impacts do. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to reflect on the impact this crisis is having on human rights. And in your context, who are the most vulnerable? High Commissioner, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm very happy to be here and have this conversation. Yes, indeed, the economic and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is and will be of an unprecedented scale. And only a few short months into the crisis, the impact is already staggering. Because according to the ILO, for example, lockdown measures are affecting nearly 2.7 billion workers, representing 81% of the global workforce. And business, of course, are facing loss of revenues and bankruptcies of an unprecedented scale, resulting, of course, in job losses for millions. And all societies include people who are marginalized and face difficulties accessing public information or accessing healthcare and other essential services for a variety of reasons. But many of the people who are most severely impacted by the crisis are those who already were very, I would say, severely impacted for other challenges in their daily struggle to survive. Because if you think on 2.2 billion people in the world, washing their hands regularly is not an option because they don't have adequate access to water. Or 1.8 billion people who are homeless, and we're telling them stay home, or have inadequate housing, so physical distancing is impossible. And marginalization creates vulnerability. The crisis is revealing how certain groups are disproportionately affected. For instance, through the overrepresentation on figures on infections and on death. Containment measures themselves have a disproportionate impact on the poorest population who can't work from home or live at a subsistence level. The pandemic has been most devastating for the lives, the health and well-being of older people, of people with underlying medical conditions, people with disabilities, and those with lower socioeconomic status, a category that tracks closely with minority status in many countries. And the poor and the vulnerable in our society are not only at greater risk from the virus itself, they are most severely affected by the negative impacts of needed measures to control it, but that they have unintended consequences. For example, those employed in the informal sector, disproportionately women, have little recourse to social protection or unemployment assistance, for example. Special attention needs to be paid to the marginalized and those in vulnerable situations. It is essential to address the widespread inequalities and discrimination that have made that some people are more vulnerable both to the disease and to the economic and social impact of the response. And we need to ensure that actions in the response, but also in the recovery phase, needs to take into consideration all these vulnerable and marginalized people. As a business, for instance, this means paying special attention to day laborers, non-contract workers, temporary employees, and those without social protection coverage who work in your supply chain, for example. Many of them are women or from vulnerable groups, and immediate assistance and support, including under lockdown measures, can be a lifeline.
Well, thank you very much, High Commissioner. Minister Anas Haq from Bangladesh, what's the impact of the crisis having on human rights in your country, and in your context, who are the most vulnerable here?
From our context, you see the most disadvantaged people are those who are workers, day laborers, and transport workers, and all kinds of street children, abandoned women, and also the Hijra community, because they work on a daily basis, and their work has been completely stopped because of the lockdown that we are in now since March the 26th. What we are facing is that we have a very great exposure so far as the garments industry is concerned, and most of our garment factories are now closed, except for a few which have been opened with all the precautions taken, but that too has been opened very recently. So we have about 3 million garment workers all over the country who are now unemployed, who have gone home. And the other disadvantaged people, as I said, are the agricultural workers, because you see, we have, during the harvest season, we have a migration of workers from one of our administrative districts to another district, but that has completely stopped now. The measure that we have taken to take advantage of the harvest season that we are going now is we have mechanized it, and those people, the people who were supposed to work in the paddy fields, are now rendered unemployed. So these are the people most impacted by the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you. And Minister, what impact is this having on their rights? Yes, we can hear you very well, but what impact is this having on their human rights?
Thank you. You see, the government has, starting from the first case, which was detected on the 8th of March 2020, the government has started taking initiatives to help these disadvantaged population. And we have, the Honorable Prime Minister has already given a financial stimulus package. The first one was to assist the garments workers, and there was a 5,000 crore taka given to the garments factories to pay the salaries of the workers, even if they are not working. And that gives them a 3-month cushion, and they will be paid for 3 months within this period. So they are being taken care of. The government is now under the social security net, now helping the poor, disadvantaged people, and it has gone up to the rural areas where we are providing food for the hungry, and that means the workers, the most disadvantaged people that I have mentioned earlier. So we are also now focused on providing for a more social safety networks. We have got the vulnerable group feeding program, the vulnerable group development program. The vulnerable group feeding program includes about 5 million people. The vulnerable group development program of the Ministry of Child and Women Affairs has about 1 million. So we are providing food for the hungry. We are also taking care of the there is a financial package which is providing them with Taka 500 and Taka 700, which in terms of Bangladeshi context is at least a great help in this time of need when you have the food supplied by the government. So we are, our Prime Minister, actually it's gone. Our Prime Minister has already, I don't know whether I'm connected or not.
Yes, we can hear you, Minister. We can hear you very well. Please, please continue.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's getting, the thing is that our Honorable Prime Minister has already laid down that the programs that have been taken by the government will not stop till even after the coronavirus is over. We do not know the time, but the thing is that this package continues for 3 months, and the other stimulus is for the industry. Totally a Taka 72,750 crore Taka stimulus packages there. One is for the industry, the other is for the small and medium enterprises. Then we have for the garments industry, and finally for the agriculture sector. So we are, the Honorable Prime Minister is covering all the sectors, and this package will be available to them immediately and at a lesser rate of interest than given. We are also.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's a very comprehensive answer, and you've clearly made a lot of commitments there to the people most vulnerable. If I could ask you, Roberto Marcus, you're the group CEO of Natura & Co. What are your reflections on the impact this crisis is having on human rights, and in your context, who are the most vulnerable?
Yeah, so Dan, first, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share this panel with the High Commissioner and the Minister. Nice meeting you both virtually. Listen, it is an unprecedented crisis, right? So we are seeing something that I don't think the world has ever seen in terms of the spread and the reach of the contagions, right? So Natura & Co. is a company that is present in over 100 countries, and as you see today, not only with our associates but also with our representatives and consultants, over 6 million. We have a very strong footprint in developing markets and in emerging markets, right? And we are seeing the impact, the human impact it's having in our network, in our associates. So early on, we made a commitment to really put people first, really prioritize the impact across our network. So how we can protect them, from job security to creating initiatives to help them navigate through the crisis. Using a phrase from Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, business can and should be a force for good. And in those set of circumstances, I think it's so important that business leaders and business in general, working with governments, working with health authorities, working with the private sector, embrace that responsibility. And I think if we all do that as a call to action, I think we can and should, navigate through this crisis in the best possible way, right? So putting people first, understanding the impact of the crisis, understanding the reach of the contagious, and then really to your point, then how we think about human rights, right? And I go back to 1948 when the letter of human rights was written at UN, in three waves: individuals, social, and collective. I just wonder, and maybe it's something to consider as we come out of this crisis, if we should think about a fourth wave, which is related to mankind, right? I think as we are seeing here, the importance of the collective, the importance of what you do impact me, what I do impacts you, right? And how we think about the right of people to come and go, but in a safe way. How we think, again, to provide health, especially for the most vulnerable people. And as we see, as the High Commission mentioned, the virus doesn't discriminate, but unfortunately, it hits harder the more underprivileged people. So how we think about providing health, how we think about somehow addressing the inequality in a world that will be different coming out of this crisis. And we needed to think about this aspect of mankind. So might be a provocative thinking, but how we think about a potentially fourth wave of human rights coming out of this crisis in a way that we think holistically about mankind.
Thank you, Mr. Marquez. High Commissioner, perhaps you could reflect on that interesting sort of idea about the importance of the collective, the rights of the collective. How do you see rights and the conversation about rights in this very difficult pandemic emergency?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity, Dan, because when I arrived here, I was surprised to see I would say the backlash on human rights. It was very difficult to put the discussion in certain areas or certain dimensions. Human rights were considered like okay, only if it's possible, and we insisted that human rights are all of them, not only political and civil rights, it's also social, economic, cultural rights, right to a clean environment. Of course, we are working strongly with a lot of companies on digital technology, artificial intelligence, and human rights, because new areas open also new questions. But I truly agree with Roberto, because one of the things I've been asking myself is, when those moments that I tried to push hard on the human rights agenda, and it was very difficult, I usually said, not a joke, but certain comment like, if tomorrow we needed to approve the Human Rights Universal Declaration, maybe we wouldn't approve it in today's world. But so I think it's a great opportunity, because it had meant people to, I hope that we do not want to go back to normal the day before COVID-19. We need to learn the lessons, because what the COVID-19 has done is to show something that we always knew, is that the huge inequalities in the world and how much people with more vulnerable groups really don't have access to main basic issues. And of course, not access to healthcare, even in very powerful countries, I have to say. It shows also something that for me as a medical doctor, a physician, has always been clear, is that investing in health is an investment, it's not a cost. But for many years, the discussions at the economic level was, it's a cost, it's not an investment. But of course, we all know what's the more important thing in every country. It's the people, in the economic words, the human capital. So we need people to be in good conditions and with good health, with welfare, and with good levels of education, etc., etc. But for many years, this was seen as a cost, and you can see that health systems were not completely prepared for something like this. So I do believe that we should learn lessons. We should understand the importance that we are all, and the Secretary General of the UN has always been saying, nobody's going to save himself by themselves. Here, the best possibility for me is that everyone else is safe. And that's why when we talk about health, we need everyone to have access to health. So it is, I think it's an opportunity to look at what's really important, what's really relevant, and to look also how we are all interconnected in good ways, but also with problems like the pandemics that can grow and grow and grow. But on the other hand, we need to ensure that we have climate action, that we ensure biodiversity, because many of these huge pandemics, all these last years, SARS, MERS, and others, are also zoonosis. They're transmitted from wild animal to domestic animal, and domestic animals or to wild animal to human beings. So we need to, it's not only how we, when we start the recovery phase, we need to think on all these dimensions, the human rights dimensions in all this area, how we respect nature and we are able to ensure climate action, because we need to find out that we have been in risk, that this is a year that we are in risk, and this is a time to think deeper. What are the kinds, which is the kind of economy that we're going to develop that can include the capacity of creating jobs, but also with more good labor conditions, which is the kind of political system that can come, that could bring more, I would say, democratic spaces to the people who can participate and be part of the solutions. So I think it's on climate action, on how we deal with all these intersecting problems, because when you look at the most vulnerable, you see that many of them are women, migrants or refugees, LGBTI communities, indigenous group, etc. So people, older people, people with disabilities. So there's a lot of intersecting issues that means that those people, their human rights are really affected. So let's hope, I'll describe myself as a strategic optimist. Let me try to be a strategic optimist and think we need to come out better, and we need to come out all together, because that's the only way we're going to go through.
Thank you. That's a great answer, and we'll come on to that future in a minute, and building the resilience into the system. Minister Anisol Haq in Bangladesh, you heard Roberto Marques talk about how business leaders really should embrace their responsibilities. In Bangladesh, are you finding, is the private sector supporting the government in the extraordinary steps you're taking to support the most vulnerable, the workers who have lost their jobs? How has the private sector stepped in to help?
I thank you for this question. I must say that the private sector has come forward and come forward very magnanimously to share with the government this responsibility and to help us get over it. We are now fighting it together. The most important thing that this pandemic has taught us is the fact that nobody can be left behind. One person left behind can also be the fatal mistake that we will be making. So we are now trying to include everyone and not to leave behind anybody within this social net. I forgot to mention about the Rohingyas, where we are also making sure that these displaced persons from Myanmar are getting the best of care possible within the network that we have. I must say that the private sector has taken into their fold the directions that have been given by our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. They have started their initiatives, and now they are also working not only through the charitable ways, but they are participating with the government in helping the vulnerable group, the most disadvantaged groups, to get over this crisis. And we really appreciate this, and we think and we hope that they will be with us all along this as we travel these difficult times.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Marques, one of the primary actions that the UN is calling on businesses to take is to repurpose their facilities and their business plans to focus on meeting the needs of this crisis. At Natura & Co, you've not only done exactly that, you've also taken a step further, I believe, to service those in need and to provide them with the necessary resources. Can you tell us a little bit about the steps that you've taken as a business, and what did you have to consider in the process?
Yeah, a very good question, Dan. And again, I'm very proud to share that the work that's been done with a lot of passion and enthusiasm by our colleagues and associates. But again, as I said, our first priority has been to put people first, but the second is being how we better serve the communities and how we can better serve the societies where we operate. We know, for example, that as part of our portfolio across our brands, Natura, Avon, Body Shop, and Aesop, we produce one product that is critical to fight the virus, which is soap. So we actually have redirect production across our manufacturers globally to increase the production of essential products and partner with other companies to produce hand sanitizers, alcohol gel, increase production of our essential products by over 30% in a very short period of time, converting manufacturing to make sure that not only we can provide that to our network, but also collaborate with health authorities and donating. Up to this point, then we have donated over 10 million units of soaps, alcohol gel, and hand sanitizers, and will continue to do so, especially in the areas of underprivilege, where people in hospitals and local authorities need the most. So it is one example of a situation where understanding how we can contribute and understanding that as part of our portfolio, we have essential products that are so important right now for the circularity of the economy, but also to help. We've been stepping up and we've been redirecting manufacturing and production to increase our capacity on those items.
Thank you very much indeed. It's really really encouraging to hear. Before we turn to questions from our audience, and there'll be many questions from a really truly global audience of people watching around the world, and thank you for your attention and interest. Let me just ask each of you to reflect on, how can business use the lessons we're learning now to guard against human rights violations in future crises? I mean, how can we build more resilience into the system so that we're better prepared for this kind of situation that we find ourselves in? High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thank you. As I mentioned before, I think the crisis has highlighted shortcomings in respect for human rights that have fundamentally weakened the global and national response. But we need to keep an eye on the future, as you said, and we develop as we at the same time are developing our short-term responses. I think the lessons learned from, and probably we will have more lessons learned because this was, unfortunately, is not going to end too soon, can lead us to a more peaceful, just, inclusive, and resilient societies where we can deliver on the promise of the 2030 agenda through the SDGs. And the Global Compact has been working with companies to ensure that the Agenda 2030 is also how the business can help on that agenda as well. The other thing is that when the crisis is over, the international community will need to redouble their efforts to ensure access to health, and including the target of universal health coverage and strengthening the capacity of all countries for early warning, for risk reduction, management of national and global health risk. And I think in all these responses, Roberto mentioned it in some way, saying how business can work more with governments, with public authorities, with health sector, but also I would say when we're looking at the recovery of the economy and the job losses and how to deal with the risk now of a closure, but then how to restart the economy afterwards. I will also say that this tripartite way of working in ILO, when you include businesses, but you also include trade unions and governments, it can try to find ways of looking at good practices and following those good practices. So the impact on people and also on work, on companies, in particular medium and small companies, but also on workers is not that big. I think we need to continue tackling inequalities that exist there. We need to ensure better labor conditions, and we need to have respect, as I mentioned before, and companies here also have to play a important role on climate action and protecting biodiversity through ensuring good sources of clean energy. So we need to work in a different way as well. I think one of the things that I think has been one of the biggest messages of the UN, but I'm not sure it has really gone through, is that when you have a pandemic, you need global cooperation, you need global solidarity, because everyone depends on the other. And unfortunately, we have not seen that yet so much. Every country has been managing its own issue by themselves, not in a coordinated way. And that is not only not the more efficient way. We understand every government needs to ensure people's life. But the problem is that if they don't do it in a coordinated way, it might happen that the pandemic can rebound, can come back again. So well, we need to, I would say it's also a very important moment to understand the importance of multilateralism, why we need to work all together, because the challenges are not one country challenges, are challenges for the whole world. And in this sense, the same international cooperation with businesses is very important. There is a good alliance on vaccines that are working, public, private, labs, WHO, another Gavi, and other organizations. And I think that that's the more important thing, that we go through all of this together, and that's the only way to ensure that we don't go back to another, I don't know if to say second wave, but at least the rebound of the pandemics.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Minister Haq in Bangladesh, I mean, how do you think business can use the lessons we're learning so that we can guard against human rights violations in the future?
I think the most important thing, while agreeing with the High Commissioner, I would say that, you see, now the private sector should come up with a partnership with the government about the social security measures for their workers, and also the health security part. Because we by this pandemic, we have understood that this kind of waves can start, and we become paralyzed when it does start. So the second time around, if God forbid this kind of things happen, we are better prepared to handle the human right crises that this kind of pandemic starts. For example, if the private sector has a proper social security net within the industry that they work, in that case, we will be able to at least help those who will become unemployed. They will not fall back on the government as they are falling back now. So if we have that kind of partnership, in that case, I think we will be better off in facing any other crises that might come up. And when we are talking about recovery, we must also think that this kind of partnership is essential to make a speedy recovery from what we are facing today. I don't know when it will end, but I am hoping, as the High Commissioner has said, that she's a strategic optimist. I am a practical optimist, and I would like that I would pray that this is over. And once it is over, then we will need a partnership of a very big scale, whereby we can all be united globally and also nationally to overcome the problems, the tragedies that this pandemic has caused. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, and thank you for that view. It's really so interesting to have a country like yours as part of these discussions. Roberto, why don't you reflect a little bit on how business can use the lessons we're learning? How can we recover stronger, recover together? How can we build resilience into our system?
Yeah, no, I would first that I could not agree more with the High Commissioner and the Minister in the way I think they share their points of view. I think there are a couple of words that comes to mind, and I think in terms of lessons learned and how we needed to think about this new norm. One is partnerships, right? And how can we enhance partnerships between private sectors and public sectors and health authorities and local authorities. Second that comes to mind is a more coordinated approach. I think, High Commissioner mentioned it well. It does feel that every country, every municipality is still trying to figure that out. And how can we work more as a collective? I think the power of the collective in dealing with situations like this global pandemic is so critical. And I do also think that especially the people running for public offices needed to step back a little bit. And I do see a lot of political elements playing into initiatives. And I think there is a call to action to almost like put that in second and third priority and really focusing on right now what we are talking about, lives and human beings, and how we needed to think about what I think the High Commissioner mentioned, which is the human capital. The world cannot exist without human capital, and we need to protect that and do everything we can to really defend that, and how we needed to think about it. And my last point is I also think that there is an opportunity, being also a kind of optimistic sense. I think coming out of this crisis, we have an opportunity to double down on and how we think about the climate crisis, how we think about some of the actions that we might needed to take coming out of this situation, and what are the things that we need to put even more emphasis. And you heard about biodiversity, which is very dear to us with all the work that we do with the Amazon forest, etc. So how we leverage biodiversity, how we leverage a situation where we make the commitments of the Agenda 2030 more front and center with the business leaders and the collective between private sector and government. So I do think then that there's going to be, despite this being such a brutal impact in society, in lives, in the economy, there's going to be some lessons learned that if we take to the heart and really act collectively, I think we can come out of that even stronger as society and as individual, as business, and as government.
Thank you very much indeed. Inspiring words. So now we're gonna move to questions. We've got a number of questions coming in from our audience. Minister Haq in Bangladesh, maybe I can ask you to reflect on this and the others as well. The question that we're receiving from many people is how multinational corporations can, ensure human rights are protected across their supply chains. What's your experience in Bangladesh of how multinational organizations, companies, are reacting, and in particular with regard to human rights?
You see, the most important thing that we are facing now is in the way of getting cancelled orders. Orders are being cancelled right, left, and center. So I will make an appeal through you and through this compact that, you see, we are ready if within a very short time, I guess, and I pray that we will be ready to to start our industries and basically the garments factories. And if the orders that has been placed earlier, if they are kept there, in that case, they will be actually helping human rights in the way that these workers will come back to work and their basic needs will be answered once they start working. So the multinationals have a very big role to play in this. And as I said, I will borrow this word from the High Commissioner, saying that there must be a global effort. And when we are talking about the global effort and Roberta's collective effort, we are talking about such kind of assistance that they come forward without cancelling the orders so that we can all participate in the recovery system.
Thank you very much, Minister. Roberto Marquez, here's a question which is coming in from a number of people as well. The role of business has already been, challenged as a question of, who the priority is, what the purpose of business is in society. Do you think this pandemic is a final step for business to prioritize stakeholders over shareholders?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've been saying that for for many years, the importance of balance, what we call, the triple bottom line, right? We always embrace that. It is about, putting, society, stakeholders, putting the environment, and putting shareholders, but not just thinking about the shareholders. And I think I'm very pleased to see many companies doing that, and I think it will be a step change of corporations, multinationals, in terms of understanding their role in society, which is, again, if we don't defend, the human capital, if we don't defend the environment, there is not going to be a world for us to run a business. If there is no world, there is not going to be a business if we don't have human capital protected with health and motivated and engaged in driving the company. So I do think that this crisis, again, it is teaching all of us important lessons about how we prioritize things, what's the role of corporations, how we better partner with local authorities and health authorities, how, again, this whole notion and discussion about should we prioritize public health versus economic growth. Well, at the end of the day, we needed to figure it out both. It's not either or. We absolutely need to protect public health. There is not even a question, but I do think that it is possible to drive economic growth in a safer environment, in a way that we gradually, bring the economy and make the circularity of the economy without compromising public health. So it's not about either or, but it's about figuring it out together, working together, and how we find the right answers.
Thank you very much. High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, a question about the impact that this pandemic is having, particularly on the rights of women and girls. This is something we discussed in a session a couple of academies ago, a rise in gender-based violence. How concerned are you about this impact in particular?
Well, I'm very concerned, and we have had a lot of webinars discussing about this because, on one hand, as you just mentioned, we have seen rising levels of domestic violence against women when they are in confinement with abusive partners, and the numbers are really impressive, how many reports and allegations have doubled. So there's a lot of things countries have been doing, from countries that have, like Spain and Portugal, that define that the services for women who are victims of violence should be considered essential, and the centers for support, and so the women have a place to go in case of huge violence. In other places, like in France, they have rented hotels so women can go to a safe place, because for some women we're telling them stay at home, be safe, but it's not a safe place to be. So that's why. On the other hand, we have all the impact of women that, as I mentioned before, they usually, in many countries, 75% of informal workers are female. And many of those work at daily basis. I mean, they have to go sell the products of a market. With the lockdowns, they have nowhere to go. With the curfew, if they don't respect it, they will go into prison. So I think the other issue is that women, the majority of many households in the world don't have water. And of course, it's great to hear from Roberto of the soap, where we even included in the humanitarian response, soap within the package of food, essential food for more vulnerable places as well. So I would say, from the point of view of the job losses, many SMEs are women as well on the informal sector. Many migrants and refugees, this will have even huge problems. When women don't have water, what they do, they go miles and miles away to fetch water from the houses, putting in danger their safety. They're raped many times, and also the health possibilities. So I would say we have clear notion that it affects much more. And on the other hand, the other important issue is 70% or more of health workers are female. and have, of course, a great exposure to the risk of getting a COVID-19. Even though until now, I have to say, the red shows that even though, I don't know if the amounts of women that are infected versus men, because we don't know how many people had contact, because testing has not been very important. So we don't know the real situation, how many people has been infected, but we know people who have been ill. But on those, the death tolls are bigger on men than on women right now. I mean, it's like 40-60 or 30-70%, depending on the country. So I would say the majority of the problems affect disproportionately women and girls, but of course, there is a concern on FAO and WFP, the World Food Program and Food and Agriculture Organization, that this could lead to climate change in some places, to food insecurity, and that much more people will be with famine. And usually what we see is that women are the last that they eat. They prefer to prioritize the children, the husband, and so on. So I would say there's a lot of clear information that women are disproportionately affected, and that's why we made the Secretary General made a call, us as well, they created a guidance, given information and recommendations, specific recommendations to each government, what to do in each case.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We're gonna wrap up now. We're getting to the end of the program. Mr. Marquez, maybe I can just ask you to make a final comment about this impact on women and girls in particular. I believe as a company, Natura & Co. have prioritized that issue as one of your initiatives in this area. And we've heard from the High Commissioner that she's a strategic optimist, that the minister is a practical optimist. What kind of optimist would you say that you are?
So starting maybe a more pragmatic, optimistic in terms of seeing, what's happening, and also trying to be, balanced in terms of what we need to do. I would say that the topic of domestic violence, to build on the High Commissioner point, is such a high priority for us, right? We are a company that for the most part work with a lot of consultants and representatives, over 6 million of them across the globe. And we are seeing this incredible unintended consequence of the self-distance and isolation, which is this increase in domestic violence. We are seeing numbers that are pretty concerning, and as a result of that, we have committed to over $1 million from the Avon Foundation to help some of the organizations that are more connected with those women and children and how to protect them. And we created a global campaign across of 4 brands that is #isolated but not alone. And it's really a call to action to give them opportunity to call out, to look for help and search for help. But most important, to tell them that they are not alone, that self-isolation or self-distance doesn't mean that we are not thinking about them, and most important, creating opportunities for them to break the cycle. So it is something that we are very committed to do it and help to continue partnering with UN in that matter then.
Well, thank you very much. High Commissioner, 1 minute, final reflections from you on how we can protect the most vulnerable.
Well, first of all, the companies, they do have to do a human rights due diligence to identify what the problems are, which are the vulnerable people, and what are the kind of measures that they need to take. But of course, we all know who the vulnerable people are. And as we mentioned, women and girls, but also older people, people living with disabilities, LGBTI communities, indigenous groups, human rights defenders, and so on. So I think a lot can be done. And let me just, please tell me one little thing on women. We every day in the most part of the world, people applaud the health workers, and the majority are women. we have seen that countries led by women have done very good to the pandemic. So I also hope that this pandemic has a positive result, has a cultural change on the importance that the world is giving to women, the acknowledgement, and of course the place they can role and they can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. And over to you in Bangladesh, Minister. Just 1 minute from you. Thank you for staying up late to join this conversation. 1 minute from you on your final reflections. We can't hear you, Minister. You're on mute, I think. Well, we'll carry on and just finish by I'd like to finish by thanking our panelists, Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you from the government of Bangladesh, His Excellency Anas ul Haq, the Minister for Law, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs, and Roberto Marquez, the Executive Chairman and Group CEO of Natura & Co. Thank you for joining us. There's a link in the chat box to register for the next week's session on global cooperation for crisis response. We look forward to hearing from a sustainable business leader and SDG advocate, Paul Polman. We'll have the Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund, Ellen Dorsey, and a special envoy to the World Health Organization's Director General on COVID-19, Dr. David Nabarro. This crisis underlines the need for strong institutions, multilateralism, as we've heard, and global partnerships. So we will ask all our speakers about the bold leadership that's needed at both the national and global level to combat the crisis and work towards a more sustainable future. So next week's session will take place 2 hours earlier at 8 a.m. Eastern on Tuesday, the 5th of March. So we hope that everybody stays safe. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Goodbye.